In Luke chapter 11, Jesus drove out a demon and people went nuts. They started to complain that Jesus must be possessed because he cast out a demon, and Jesus had to explain that that didn't make sense. And at the end of that defense and frustration, Jesus calls them a wicked generation with these words: "The queen of the south will rise in judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them. For she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and now one greater than Solomon is here." Now, this is a really strange statement because no one was angry at Jesus for his wisdom. In fact, he hadn't even been saying wise things. He had been defending himself for casting out a demon. So why bring Solomon into it? If we only read the Bible, it makes no sense. But just like today, the people of Jesus' day did not get all of their ideas from Scripture. Jesus in Luke is referring to a well-known story about Solomon that isn't in the Bible at all. It's actually found in the Testament of Solomon, a non-canonical book, where Solomon is given a magic ring that lets him control demons and use them to make the temple. Jesus here is pointing out that Solomon had a magic demon-controlling ring and they thought he was awesome, yet here Jesus stands without the ring, yet with greater control, and they still complain and doubt. Now, is Jesus saying this story about Solomon is true? No. But he is certainly relying on the people knowing that story and thinking that it was true in order to make his point. And this isn't even close to the only time in the Bible where someone quotes or relies on something else outside of Scripture. It happens a lot. The Bible is not a self-contained little bubble that rejects any outside influence or that claims that truth and inspiration can only be found within its pages. In fact, the Bible regularly incorporates other sources from outside when they are useful. The best examples of this are the enormous volume of reference materials used to compile the histories of the Old Testament, particularly Kings and Chronicles. Other works that didn't survive until today are regularly mentioned as excellent sources for further information, that the biblical works are basically the Cliff Note versions of these other sources. The biblical authors clearly viewed these books as highly accurate and helpful, and to most Christians this isn't a problem at all because they're mostly books of poetry and dry history, not theology. But there are other instances where biblical theology relies upon outside sources. 2 Corinthians 11:14, for instance, casually mentions that Satan masquerades as an angel of light, assuming we already knew that. But it's not found in Scripture anywhere. Instead, it is a reference to the life of Adam and Eve, where Satan is revealed as transforming to look like an angel. Similarly, the notion of a third heaven, mentioned in 2 Corinthians 12:2, has no basis in Scripture either, but is from the book 2 Enoch, where the heavens are separated out, and third heaven is set aside as a garden paradise for the righteous who have lived holy lives, which is how the third heaven is described in verse 4, paradise. Now, these are important theological points that are accepted as given by the biblical authors, but come from non-canonical sources. Clearly, the biblical authors had no problem with truth and inspiration in some form existing outside of the canon. Another good example of this is how the New Testament twice mentions that the law was given to Moses through an angelic mediator. What? That's not in the Bible either, but it was part of the cultural understanding. The biblical text raised a question. How could Moses speak with God and not die? And the people came up with an answer. Well, the law must have been passed on through someone else, not given directly. This is something we still do today. The Bible raises the question of why were there 3 gifts given to Jesus by the Magi? And so the culture comes up with an answer. There must have been 3 Magi. And so now we have a very deep cultural tradition of the 3 wise men, even though that's not mentioned in Scripture. But these examples are allusions to something else rather than direct quotations. For that, we need to take a look at Jude 14 and 15. Where the author directly quotes from the book of Enoch. Now, here Jude not just casually refers to something as common knowledge, but is specifically quoting a non-canonical work as inspired prophecy. Clearly, he did not see God working as something limited to the books we have in our Bible alone. And no, Jude does not say that the entire book of Enoch is inspired, but certainly he felt that this part at least was worthy of passing on. However, it gets even stranger, because not only does the Bible quote from Jewish sources outside the canon, it quotes some truly pagan sources too. Acts 17, for instance, quotes from 3 Greek sources, 2 of which were originally written as praises to Zeus that Paul repurposes. We have prayers to Zeus in our Christian canon. Now, Paul is obviously repurposing them in an effort to take what the people of Athens already knew and use it to point to Jesus. But one of these pagan sources, Epimenides, is quoted again as a prophet in Titus 1:12 and is used to validate a racist stereotype about the people of Crete. But at least we know where those sources come from. There are numerous quotes and references in the Bible that we just don't have a source for, including passages where the quote is attributed to Scripture, but can't be found in any of ours or any surviving text we have. Like Matthew 2:23, where it says, "And he shall be called a Nazarene," or James 4:5. Whatever scripture the authors are referring to, they considered it inspired, but we certainly don't recognize it as part of our canon today. God is at work in all who listen, and it is okay to say that we can see bits of God in something, or we can see God in part of something, but not in all of it. So I am glad that the Bible quotes from other books. I am glad we have the history cited, showing that facts and truth can exist outside of the Bible. I am glad we have pagan quotes and quotes to books we don't wholly accept to remind us that something doesn't have to be perfect for us to be able to see some of God in it. We turn to the Bible, not because it is the sole repository of all of God's work, but because it is the most important, the most proven, the bedrock that we check other sources against. It contains all of the essential nutrients, so to speak, and everything else just contains a vitamin or two. But there is value in other works, from histories to cultural assumptions, from mystery books to pagan poetry. Glimpses of God can be seen in there, and the biblical authors recognize that by quoting them. That's not a bad thing. Now, I didn't cover anywhere near all of the instances of extra-canonical citations within Scripture. A lot of them are still debated. But next week will be a look at my favorite of those stories that didn't make it in here. Moses' pet rock that followed him around. Yes, that actually made it into Scripture. I hope you'll come back for it. Until then, thanks for watching. Have a great week. See you next Friday.